Hey, Cypher here. And are you ready for some more Dunkirk action? Woo! 3 Oscars! Wait. Darkest Hour isn't an action film? Pfft, fine. I guess I'll talk about a bunch of old dudes talking in safety. But in all seriousness, this is an interesting movie. It messes up almost everything pretty badly, to the point of being irksome, but it is also somewhat endearing. Churchill was quite a character, but they took some liberties that are a little too much to handle. But at least, I get to talk about the guy. He was a bit of a historian after all, so consider this a Historians Who Changed History episode as well. Winston Churchill was born into aristocracy. His father had numerous posts and was devoted to his job until syphilis caught up with him. Winston's mother was a bit of a lush, which he would inherit. Cheers. So he was brought up by a nanny and sent to boarding schools. Eventually, he got into a cavalry college. Having graduated, Churchill joined the Hussars. He went all over the world and fought in Cuba alongside the Spanish, became a reporter for the Malacan force in India, and rode with the Lancers from Cairo to fight in Sudan. He wrote about all of these and even published 2 books, which he of course used the proceeds to pay for his excessive tastes in cigars and liquor. Cheers. After a failed bid for a parliamentary seat, Churchill traveled into the midst of the Second Boer War as a journalist. After a train he was riding on got derailed by artillery, he was captured by the Boers. But he escaped through a latrine and eluded the Boers for over 250 miles, all the way to safety. He turned around and joined a light horse brigade to take the very place he had been imprisoned. This adventure, of course, made for another book of his. Partially because of his success in South Africa, he got elected to Parliament in 1900 as a Conservative. 4 years later, he hopped the floor to the Liberal Party. Throughout his time in Parliament, he'd hold a variety of positions, too numerous to list. But he was influential in the liberal reforms that brought welfare in the early 20th century to Britain. He was promoted to First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, where he served until World War I. During that war, he continued for a couple of years, but lost his position because of his heavy involvement in the planning of the Gallipoli campaign. He eventually ended up as a commander on the Western Front for a few months. He returned to Britain in mid-1916 to become a leader in the War Office by the end of the following year. From there, he pushed a vehemently anti-Bolshevik agenda, campaigning for a full-scale takeover of Russia. He wanted to use gas bombing in Moscow, which he would want again with the Kurdish rebellion. A few years later, he plotted with Finland to start a war, and set up a scheme for providing arms to Poles for their fight against the Soviets. He also secretly helped anti-Irish militias, continuously opposed Indian home rule, and his hawkish behavior? Wow, all this British stuff has me spelling words in their wrong way. Dang it. And his hawkish behavior even extended to Turkey during the Chinook crisis. This was the final nail in the coffin of the Liberal Party, which was pushed out of the coalition government just in time to be destroyed in the following election. The party never recovered from this defeat. 2 years later, Churchill joined the Conservatives again, where he became Chancellor of the Exchequer. After the defeat of the Conservatives in 1929, he became estranged from the party and instead chose to support himself by writing some history books, including the first draft of his later published History of the English-Speaking Peoples, which means he was totally a historian, but about as orthodox of one there could ever be, and he also doesn't have much scholarly value, just really good prose. Is essentially that old mode of history being written to create nationalism. But he needed the money too, because he wasted much of it on booze and cigars. Cheers. He continued to lobby for various causes, such as opposing German rearmament and further opposition to Indian independence. In 1936, he was one of the few supporters of the king's marriage to a twice-divorced American. Because of her divorce status, this caused a constitutional crisis, leading to the abdication of the king, who had ruled for less than a year. When World War II began, he was still on the outs of the Conservative Party. He had been privately critical of Neville Chamberlain's Nazi appeasement policy. Despite that, he was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty again, putting him on Chamberlain's war cabinet. A month later, Chamberlain resigned and Churchill took his place, just in time for the German invasion of France. His ascent was that rapid. As Prime Minister, he pushed however he could, trying to get arms for Britain and encouraging the island while it was held hostage by the Blitz. Most endearing were his speeches, often given to Parliament and then pushed to broadcast over the radio. Oh, and for those who commented on the Dunkirk episode that Churchill's speeches were done by a voice actor, that is a myth spread by none other than David Irving, a discredited historian, because of his Holocaust denial. Best not to swallow his disgraceful rhetoric. It is based on testimony that has been proven false. Anyways, he managed to secure the Lend-Lease program with the United States, which helped sustain Britain's war effort during the Blitz. After Operation Barbarossa and Pearl Harbor, the tide turned against Germany when America and the Soviet Union joined the war. From that darkest hour, Britain prevailed with her new allies. Despite Churchill's early fervent anti-Bolshevism, he and FDR met with Joseph Stalin on several occasions during the war as allies.
Then Stalin wanted to jump on Churchill's belly. Boingy, 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 boingy.
These conferences shaped the post-war era, which some see as the beginning of the Cold War. Many of them remain controversial today. Other controversies followed Churchill. A famine in Bengal occurred in 1943 as a result of the war. His racist comments and mismanagement of resources has been scurrilously called genocide. Another scandal he was ultimately in charge of were the Dresden bombings, which developed into a gigantic firestorm in the city in early 1945, just a few months shy of Germany's surrender, resulting in around 24,000 deaths. The firestorm was accidental, but provoked a lot of Nazi propaganda to the point that some misrepresent it as a Holocaust. Victory was achieved just a few months after Dresden, and Churchill remained in office for all of 2 months. In those months, he managed to cause some more controversy. He ordered the planning of Operation Unthinkable, where the British would surprise attack their former Soviet allies, the first of such plans in Cold War history. Then he ordered British troops to oppose the French in Syria, who were brutally quelling a nationalist movement there. The Conservatives were voted out mere months after VE Day, and Churchill with them. He became the leader of the opposition instead. He spent this time opposing Soviet expansion, even popularizing the term Iron Curtain through one of his speeches.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent.
He also encouraged the creation of the Council of Europe, a separate organization from today's European Union, but an important part of its formation. He had said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." So he did just that, penning a 6-volume set of the history of World War II. His History of the English Peoples was finally published, and he made a tidy profit off all of it. Yet again, funding his drinking habit. Cheers. Conservatives were voted a majority in 1951, and Churchill became Prime Minister again. He mostly tried to keep Britain's special relationship, as he called it, with the US alive, and called for another conference between them and the USSR. He saw this as a way to avoid another world war. No summit was held, though. Instead, he had to deal with a couple of colonial issues. Communists had been fighting a guerrilla war in Malaya, which the British had to help. The fighting there continued well after Churchill's tenure as Prime Minister. Another rebellion broke out in Britain's Kenya colony in 1952, called the Mau Mau Uprising. Fighting there continued beyond Churchill's premiership as well. Both were brutal wars, fought by controlling the population through divide and rule strategies. Churchill did not stick around for the decade these fights would continue through. He had a stroke in 1953 and resigned shortly thereafter, for obvious reasons. Too bad certain presidents couldn't do that. He continued to serve as an MP, becoming most senior MP in 1959, also known as the Father of the House. After his death in 1965, he was given the last state funeral in British history, something that is only normally reserved for reigning monarchs. That was a lot. Biographies are difficult to shorten, and there have been a lot of biographies of Churchill. He's probably the most written about figure in British history by this point. I had no lack of biographies to choose from. It's like finding biographies of Abraham Lincoln. Don't you people have anything better to do? He practically wrote his own biography, so why does there need to be a new one every bloody year? They aren't even presenting anything new. They haven't for years. If you want a hatchet job or a hagiography, it's out there for you already. This movie clearly relies on the latter approach. The movie's title seems to be referencing Churchill's own Their Finest Hour.
We have proclaimed our willingness at the darkest hour in French history to conclude a union of common citizenship in this struggle. That if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
But they also clearly chose to ignore a great deal and focus on the popular perception of Churchill, rather than be honest. Typical movie bullcrap. Before we get into that, let's talk about why the movie is good, before we get to how all that good goes to waste. The character of Churchill in this is well formed. His attitude and disposition seem to be perfectly in line with the real deal. He was a bit manic, overbearing, and always drinking or smoking.
We have a drunkard at the wheel.
Please make it stop. Cheers. I think Churchill would have recognized himself in this characterization, and that is high praise given the movie is basically completely about his character. It also shows us how much opposition he faced in the early years of the war.
His record is a litany of catastrophe.
Which is accurate for the most part. The whole Halifax and Churchill fight really happened.
Would you stop interrupting me while I am interrupting you?
Unfortunately, it commits a falsification even with this, where it shows Chamberlain as plotting to overthrow Churchill through this debate.
So I shall resign first. You then follow. That's critical if we're to trigger a vote of no confidence in the House.
Which is false. Chamberlain did no such thing. You'll see everything good about this film is undone by its lies. That was a short accuracy section, right? That's because it's mostly inaccurate. How can you get so much wrong when the movie covers so little time? Well, it's partially because it covers so little time. It combines a bunch of stuff that is unnecessary, just to compress this into a movie plot. Any thorough examination shows that this was poorly conceived. Time compression is understandable sometimes if it doesn't give a false impression, but they really shove the date at you. Every day is depicted with this big, bold graphic, right there in front of your face telling you the date. It makes you think that this is authentic, and all this craziness happened in such a short period of time. Well, it didn't. It's all based around Churchill having to campaign against Halifax to stop any peace talks from happening. Besides the fact that there was a bit of verbal jousting, the rest didn't happen. We see the beginning of Churchill using the V for victory sign, along with its backwards vulgarity. Well, that didn't happen until a year later during the Blitz. We see the War Cabinet meeting in a bunker. Why would they do that? Nothing's attacking them yet. The Blitz hasn't happened. And just as you would expect, they didn't start meeting in the bunker until during the Blitz. Churchill is shown to waver in his resolution, even admitting to Halifax that there should be negotiations given certain conditions. This is not present in the cabinet minutes, nor in any accounts. That would be a pretty big deal if it happened, wouldn't it? And even the debate shown over negotiations excludes a key component.
Really? Yes, sir. It is the reason I sit in this chair.
Churchill had plenty of support in these debates, and there was no explosive arguments. Other cabinet members were able to diffuse tension in the classically British passive-aggressive manner. It shows him advising the Navy to requisition the small boats for Dunkirk,
Civilian boats, as many as you can get your hands on.
but the setup for that had happened before he was even Prime Minister. To begin the evacuation, it shows him asking the name of the operation, where it shows a dynamo generator.
We need a name for this operation.
Well, Churchill didn't request the name, plus, that thing wasn't even working at the time. The king never made a nighttime visit to Churchill's bedroom to offer advice and support during the evacuation of Dunkirk. On that advice, which never happened, the most touching scene in the film happens. The protagonist jumps out of his taxi and hops onto the London Underground to mingle with commoners.
What are you all staring at? Have you never seen a Prime Minister ride the Underground before?
They even encourage him, giving him the classic line that he will use for his next speech.
If we enter into a peace deal with him right now, what would you say to that?
Never!
He then channels that energy into his most famous speech of that period.
We shall never surrender!
Well, that never happened. Touching as it may be, it is completely out of character. In fact, that is why it is touching. It's a flight of fancy. Now, they could have added this as a dream sequence or something, but they filmed it as though it were real. The director and actors have been upfront about this one inaccuracy, but not how it tears the movie apart. Showing the never surrender line coming from commoners makes Churchill seem like he was a man of the people, when he clearly wasn't. Every bit of the movie hangs on that moment. Oh, and a final inaccuracy, with the whole big dates on screen, they got the speech off by 6 days. It was given as though the evacuation was still going on, but it had just concluded. That's the whole point of the speech.
Suddenly, the scene is cleared. The crash and thunder has, for the moment, but only for the moment, died away. A miracle of deliverance achieved by valor, by perseverance, by perfect discipline, by faultless service, by resource, by skill, by unconquerable fidelity, is manifest to us all.
By getting the date wrong, they made the speech seem like it was a plea to fight, when in reality, the fight it was talking about was already over, and the Blitz was about to begin. What a load of rubbish. I was genuinely fooled by this film. Before watching, I thought, I've done enough research on this for Dunkirk, and World War II is so overdone. I'll spot whatever I need. So I watched without researching first, and thought the movie was great. But that underground scene had me questioning things. As I dug into it, more and more of the film began to unravel. Now if I were to rewatch it, I'd be grimacing most of the time. You can always make a drinking game out of it. Just drink every time Churchill does. You'll get through the movie just fine. Cheers. Ugh. I think Churchill would have recognized himself in this characterization, and that is high praise, given the movie is basically completely about his character. Program with the United States, Winchester Rye, man. This stuff is awesome. Just saying.